Hey, y'all. Tonight I am so excited to be talking about unraveling the climate crisis and climate crisis. I'm not sure exactly what I said there. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Greg Laden and Dr. Kyle Johnson. So buckle up, sit back, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you chose us to spend your Thursday with. I am so excited to reintroduce to you two guests that I've had on some other really great shows. We have Greg Laden and David Kyle Johnson, who goes by Kyle. So for those that have not met you before, I would just like a quick blurb from each of you. Kyle, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself? What would you like people to know about you?
Okay, so I'm a professor of philosophy at King's College. The reason I would be on to talk about the climate crisis is that I teach and publish on scientific reasoning quite a bit, and like what science reasoning is and what it entails and what it can prove and what it can't. In particular, I teach courses on science and pseudoscience, and climate denial is pseudoscience. So I know a little bit about identifying pseudoscience and identifying why climate denial is pseudoscience. I've also written a couple of papers on climate change in my foray into pop culture and philosophy. So I do a lot of work using pop culture to popularize philosophy, and also I treat pieces of pop culture as philosophical arguments in a certain kind of way. And so I have a couple of papers that integrate climate change into like a couple of pieces of pop culture that are making arguments about climate change. One of them is an episode of the wonderful show, The Orville. And another one is the recent Netflix movie, Don't Look Up. I have about a 20,000 word paper I wrote with Chris Lay on that delves into Don't Look Up argument about climate change. And so, so that's what I do. And that would be basically why I'm here to talk about climate change.
Fantastic. Great. I'm excited because I loved that movie too, that Netflix movie. So looking forward to getting into that. And Greg, what about you? What would you like people to know?
Yeah, well, so I'm an anthropologist specializing in both archaeology and bioanthropology. So I guess I would call myself sometimes a paleoanthropologist. And as such, when I was really doing mostly archaeology of North America, I ended up in the Boston area at a small college there doing some research and eventually getting my PhD there. And while I was there, I was exposed to a project that was underway called the Bay of Fundy Gulf of Maine project. And it was archaeologists looking at undersea resources in the Atlantic from Cape Hatteras to the Bay of Fundy. And it was all the research was done when I got into it, but I was like sort of administering the post-research work. And that's when I discovered that, as someone who's been doing historic archaeology of, George Washington, slept here kind of stuff, that sea levels had changed dramatically over recent times. This is, in the 1970s we're talking about. And that huge parts of the North American region were inundated. And it was fascinated me, the idea that major Native American cultures that we just saw little tiny bits and pieces of on what is now dry land lived across this giant shelf and receded with the sea over a period of just a couple thousand years. Short enough time that there would be major leaps in sea level rise in generational time that people would have it as part of their culture, possibly. And then I realized, and so that got me interested in climate change, because that was an effect of climate change. So I incorporated that in my research. Since then, did a lot of work on coastal resources, looking at how sea level rise fast versus sea level rise slow changes the coastal ecology, and so on. And then I started working eventually on my PhD, and this really interesting event happened. And that is Glenn Isaac, who was my advisor, created a miniature conference. And the number of people speaking at the conference, about 6 of them, was almost exactly the same as the number of graduate students that Glenn had that were the attendees of the conference. So we created an amazing symposium for us. We invited the people from geology department stuff. Other people came, but it was Shackleton and Opdyke and Wally Broker and a bunch of people like that who revealed their current. Emiliani was there from Italy. They revealed the way that they had just put together deep sea core research and reviving ancient Milankovitch theory about orbital geometry and adding it to isotope research that was just becoming available, which is now very common, stable isotope research, which mapped sea level change over time extremely accurately as you could date a sea core, and we created understanding that if you want to explain human evolution or human change or prehistory or any evolution over the last 2 or 3 million years, in terms of climate change, you had to have mechanisms that operated in a 14,000 year time frame or less, because that was in a short periods, or have something that it just changed our framework. In other words, everything about evolution and prehistory before that was it takes millions of years for something to happen, which has always been suspect because we know the average length of time of a species on Earth is less than a couple of million years. So it's anyway, that was happening at the same time, not long after Alvarez and Eldridge and Gould. So we were really changing the tempo and mode of understanding prehistory. So when I went off to do so that got me interested in climate change. My research, PhD research, didn't really involve any of this, but I was always fascinated with it, and ended up, I did publish one paper on deep sea temperature changes with John Abraham. But mostly somewhere there in the post-late graduate school days, I started doing science writing, science communication. And climate change was, to me, a really important thing to do that with, because I could see it, other people could see it, but most people weren't paying attention to it. And I was writing about it. Mostly people weren't reading or didn't care. So I've always done that. So I have a cadre of close friends and colleagues that are all climate scientists or climate communicators, and we all keep in touch, and we all jointly review new research and talk about it and figure out how to explain it, and work on that. At the same time, I'm now communications director for the DFL Environmental Caucus, which is a political organization in Minnesota, and we have been advocating for climate change related legislation. And this is a little bit of a political story, but we have been so successful in Minnesota getting climate change related legislation passed and implemented, not only thoroughly, but very quickly. In the last few years, we've done a lot, that the National Democratic Party came to us last year and said, could you explain to us how you do this? Because we want to do it too. And I can't tell you that I saw it because I promise complete secrecy, but you're not going to tell anybody this. But I've seen the draft DNC platform related to climate change, and it's really good. So I think that our group has influenced that. So I have a political interest in it, and we can talk later about the Heartland Institute if you want, because that was another part of the chapter of the story of my involvement. Everyone knows about the Heartland Institute now, and in up until a few months ago, nobody knew about it, but they've always been there, and they've always been on top of climate change as one of the major forces in creating climate denialism. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for agreeing to come on the show. The first thing I kind of wanted to talk about is what are the biggest climate denial things that you guys have been hearing before we get into your work. I've been very concerned about climate change denial and what's been going on with a lack of the U.S. being involved in the solution, where it seems like other countries are kind of leading the charge, whereas the U.S. used to be the leader in those things. So I was just curious what you guys feel about that, what you guys think some of the biggest problems are, that sort of thing. And I think, Kyle, we'll go with you first.
Okay, so you're kind of asking three different questions, I think. One is, what are the most common denialist arguments that are out there? And then what do you think about the fact that the U.S. is not taking the lead, right, on climate change, on doing something about climate change? And then what was the third question that was in there?
Well, I think we'll stop there.
Okay.
We'll go with that.
Fair enough. So, for me, I mean, the denialism has mainly, at least in my circles, has taken the form of what I call lukewarmerism. And I'm not the only one that calls it lukewarmerism. It's this because it's really hard to deny, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, that global warming isn't happening, right? Because we've had the 2 hottest years, the last 2 years, and the last 12 months or whatever been the hottest on record, et cetera, right? Like that's really hard to deny. So there's not a lot of denial on that. What lukewarmerism is this movement that tries to pretend like it is friendly to science and to the science on climate change. And it kind of admits that climate change is real and that humans are involved, et cetera, but then tries to make the case that it's really not that big of a deal. The warming is not going to be that much. Even if it is, the effects of the warming are not going to be that grandiose. They're not going to be along for a very long time. And anything that we try to do about will actually just make things worse. Like the effects of what we try to do will be worse than the actual climate change. Like if we limit fossil fuels, it'll raise the cost of energy too much. And they pretend to really care about the poor. They're like, oh, it'll make energy too expensive for the poor, and we can't do that. So we shouldn't do anything about climate change. Again, it's called lukewarmerism, right? It is often put forth by people who are actually denialists. There's this Stephen Novell's got a great book called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. It's a podcast I listen to a lot. It's very good. Their last kind of bonus chapter is on climate change, and they call it it's called the Mott and Bailey fallacy. I always forget. It's an ancient term about how you basically have like a castle in the middle and a yard on the outside. And when the fighting's easy, you go out to the outside and you fight. But then when things get hard, you retreat to the valley where it's easier to make your defenses or whatever, right? And so the Mountain Valley fallacy is these people are actually denialists. So when they're not challenged, what they'll say is climate change is a hoax. It's not really real. Warming isn't happening. They'll make all of those bullshit arguments that are easy to debunk. When they're debunked, they won't admit that they were wrong. They'll retreat and go, "Well, no, I didn't mean that it wasn't real. It's real. It's just not it's not as bad as we think it is, right?" And they try to cast aspersions about how much agreement there is about how fast warming will occur, what the effects will be, et cetera, and they'll kind of pretend to be a friend of science until you back off them, and then they'll go back to denying the entire thing is real at all. Right? And so that's the most common one. Like if I see it in my students or whatever, it's almost always lukewarmerism that comes out of the mouth of some of my students. It's not that common, fortunately, but I have heard that kind of thing. And there's, in one of my papers, I point out like 5 different things that's wrong with this. They're wrong about the consensus. They're wrong about the fact that we don't know how bad it will be. One of the main problems with it is that its risk analysis is wrong. Right? Like, even if it's true that we don't know for sure how bad it will be, that doesn't mean that, well, then it'll be better, right? It could also be worse. If we really don't know how bad it's going to be, it could be worse. And so that's what you should be preparing for, right? So the whole argument for lukewarmerism, grounded in the idea that, well, we really don't know how bad it will be, well, then we better start doing something about it because it could be worse than we think. And in fact, from the research, at least, and maybe Greg can back me up on this, but the research I've seen is that we haven't overestimated the effect of global warming. We've underestimated it, right? Warming is happening faster than we thought. The effects are more grandiose and more dangerous than we thought, right? And this is partly because, whenever panels of scientists are, making announcements about these things, they have to kind of pull things back for some of the people who are a little bit more reserved on it to get everybody to sign on. And it looks like that made them underestimate the effects. And so it's actually worse than we thought, right? But lukewarmerism is bankrupt, both scientifically and morally, really, and it's rooted in what motivates it more than anything, at least in my experience, is libertarianism. Libertarians live and die by the idea that deregulation makes everything better, right? Any regulation is always bad. It always makes things work. And one of the core tenets of this is the invisible hand, right? Like if you just let people alone and let them do what they want, they will magically work to the benefit of everyone, right? Perhaps that works in certain circles. It decidedly does not work with the climate. or the environment in general. If you just let people unregulated do what they want, they just exploit the environment for their own short-term benefit until there's no resources left. We've seen that over and over and over again. It's called the tragedy of the commons. This happens over and over again, right? So the fact of climate change is direct evidence that that notion libertarianism is completely false, right? So of course they have to deny that it's real, because if they don't, the entire edifice of their entire raison d'etre, right? The entire philosophical idea behind the whole thing. Regulation is always bad. Free market and deregulation is always better. A visible hand always makes things work for the better. That whole thing is debunked by the reality of climate change. So of course they have to deny it. And so what I argue in one of my papers is that this is what leads to lukewarmerism. It's called the backfire effect, right? People will ignore evidence and excuse away evidence if it makes something false that conflicts with their self-identity. And libertarianism is very often, like most political identities, is very tied to a person's self-identity. And so since that means that would contradict their self-identity, they have to deny it. So that's what motivates it. But it's scientifically bankrupt. Did that help?
Okay, so I agree with everything that you just said. I also see in my areas that it's not just a libertarian problem, but it's also a religious.
Yeah.
That's mixed in with conservative ideology. That's what I see. I see that either it's all a lie because liberals are trying to get us to not have big trucks and stuff like that. And the second thing is it doesn't even matter anyway because God will save us. So this is like part of the plan.
Right.
So Greg, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I agree with basically everything Kyle said. I'll push back on one little thing later, but everything else I agree with. It isn't a simple case of there having been phases of denial that are distinct in time and, shift from one. There's always been a little bit of everything going on at once. The idea that climate change isn't happening at all was certainly part of the picture earlier. And like Kyle said, you can't say that anymore. The idea that there's conspiracies going on, the idea that the consensus is false, the idea that climate change is actually a good thing, which it is under certain circumstances in small amounts, but not this climate change. One thing I would add, and the lukewarming is absolutely the current kind of most predominant thing, the lukewarmism. I would add to this a little bit, and that is to say that starting when as the evidence became more overwhelming than was allowable by the idea that it isn't true, and that started to happen a few years ago. The arguments, the very specific arguments, began to involve short versus long-term looks at climate change. Famous example being looking at the pause. The pause and the consensus arguments were kind of simultaneous in time, but there was a period of time where if you put on, squinted really hard and looked at the graph just right, you could see that global warming had flatlined, was no longer increasing. Now that was, of course, for about 5 years, and it is true that the rate of increase drops to almost negative now and then, but in 8 out of 10 years it's not, and it's also increased since. So that the pause, the famous pause, was an example of that. And now, of course, it's been long enough that you can look at the pause on a graph and see that it's not really there anymore. Right. I think in all of this time, keep in mind that two things have converged here. One is in terms of methodology. There was a pre-existing anti-evolution structure of argument that was made just against evolutionary biology. And that involved, as a product of that, you have things like the Gish-Gallop, which has come back. Suddenly people are using the word Gish-Gallop again. Yeah. And it's like all those people, I discovered this thing called the Gish-Gallop. Yeah, I know. We've been doing that for 40 years, okay? Because Donald Trump did it one day, ineffectively. But the idea that your argument is simply untethered from any kind of logical structure. So you can go anywhere you want with your argument, and as the argument cools down in one area, you pick it up in a different area and you just change it. And that's always been there, but that comes from the evolutionary creationism debate. And on the other side, you have the tobacco lobby of yore, which created funding structures and structures for getting money in from deep pockets of libertarian deep pockets. Yeah, it is libertarians. Libertarian deep pockets going into funding to preserve smoking, to oppose anti-smoking legislation as part of this deregulation problem. And that's, if you look at the early days of the Heartland Institute and the Bradley Institute and other groups like that, that's what they were doing back in those days. Yeah. And so their methodology for funding and their methodology for arguments comes from smoking and deregulation on one hand and creation versus evolution on the other hand. And again, there's, Sonny, your religious part of it again, right? So it marries into the current recent climate denial structure. And the Heartland Institute, which is now seen as being the kind of organizing force behind Project 2025, which I assume listeners all know about, was the conduit for money from other institutions and trusts and individuals that went into, they funded a lot of climate denial. They still do a lot of climate denialism. So that's part of it. The thing I'll push back on a little bit, Kyle, as you said, that the concept of how bad it is may have been watered down a little bit by scientists in the context of having to be believable.
Not believable. Like, I was thinking in terms of like when you're at a big conference and like you're not a big, like you're part of a very large organization. The organization is putting forth a statement, and they want everybody in the organization to sign on in the statement.
Yeah.
There might be some people in there who think that they're a little bit more conservative about how bad they think it is. Okay. And so the whole statement is pulled back a little bit to get everybody on board. Yeah.
The one example I know of where that is a factor is, the American Meteorological Association, which not only made that would have been a factor, but even more so, it consisted of people within the scientific community. There are physicists, paleoclimatologists, people looking chemists, people organic earth chemists, earth system scientists, let's say, including chemists, and then meteorologists and so on. And there's this sort of almost like an engineer versus academic spectrum. And people over the engineer spectrum tend to be more akin to meteorology, and people over on the science spectrum are the modelers and the scientists, and the paleoclimatologists. So, and within that, by the way, I mentioned before, I work with a group of like-minded scientists. We're not like-minded politically. We are all over the spectrum politically, and not American. I mean, 2/3 of us are not based in the U.S. at all. So it's not that. But what you have with the American Meteorological Association, they absolutely were dragged kicking and screaming in the dirt to admit that climate change has caused any weather event of any kind in any way that you could say it for sure. And really recently, they've come on board with that. But otherwise, I would say that the washing down, two things here. First, the watering down of the concept of how bad climate change would be primarily came, maybe from things like you're talking about, but I think it primarily came from the press and political side of this. The press always has to have two sides, and one side ends up being the scientists are saying this is true. Well, maybe some other people say it isn't true. So, and that really messed it up. And if you follow a writer like Chris Mooney at the Washington Post, he's a person who is consistently sticking with the scientific idea throughout. So just take any issue of the Washington Post with a Chris Mooney article on climate change, and then look at anything else in the same issue of the newspaper on climate change, and you'll see that's your residual. That's where the press is going off to the side more. But recently, there's a current thing, and we all respect expertise. And we all like it when experts chime in and explain things. You have Carl Sagan talking in your opening of your show. I mean, we all respect expertise, but we should not idolize it. And sometimes experts, when they get old, go off the rails and aren't credible anymore. And James Hansen is one of those people, I'm afraid to say. James Hansen was one of the people that really pushed for climate change being important. He wrote Storms of Our Grandchildren. He was this lead scientist in NASA GSS for a long time. Really important guy, but he then started to see more severity in climate, and he has become an alarmist. And by alarmist, I don't mean someone who's saying something real that's going to happen and is alarmed. I mean the scientific community does not agree with him on what he says is going on. They just don't. And so a lot of people are leaning, and he recently wrote a paper in which he said the rate of global warming is much higher than currently being stated by mainstream scientists, is much worse. That's not true. Okay. The rate of warming is a function of what we do to the atmosphere. And the relationship between what we do to the atmosphere and warming is now pretty well understood, and nothing unusual is happening with that model. There's no extra warming happening that anyone is seeing. There is extra warming. It's called pollution. Okay, and we actually have a good.
It's not worse than we were expecting.
It's not worse than we were expecting, and we were hoping for better because we were hoping to do something. But one thing I can tell you is that the one way in which the models have shifted over the last few years that hasn't gotten out there much yet is that it was really thought before that CO2 has an incredibly long lifespan, and it starts warming when it appears in the atmosphere. Extra CO2 starts warming like turning a pot of water on in your stove, and it takes a long time for the water to boil. So we put X amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, and then that means in 200 years we're going to have this severe effect that's going to move in that direction that whole time. We now know or think that it isn't that long. The CO2 actually gets absorbed in the ocean faster than we were thinking, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it gets out of the atmosphere anyway, and its effects happen quicker than we were thinking. So the warming we have now is the warming we're going to get from the CO2 we have now, plus a little bit, not a lot. Okay. Which means if we stop polluting now, we get to save the planet. So the alarmism, part of it's a dilemma. The other side of lukewarmism is alarmism. They're the same argument. There's nothing really to see here. There's nothing we can do about it.
Right. I see. Yeah.
Right. So that's
So how long is the effect? Instead of 200 years, if the CO2 we're releasing today, when will we feel the effects of that? Like how many years in the future? Or what?
It's years. It's just years. It's not decades or centuries. It's just years.
Okay. Good. Good. Not decades or centuries. Right. Yeah. That's something I had worried about for a long time. Not being a scientist, that I had heard the warming that we're feeling now was from the CO2 we released in the 70s or something like that.
And that's true. That's true. That some of it. Yeah.
It's a
some of it's from the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. The increase we're seeing is amazing, and so we're going to be really hurting because we're releasing so much more now than we were in the 70s, and so it's going to. Right. That's really good news. That if the effect is only a few years, then if we pull back now, it will have a more immediate effect.
I think the most current easy way to get. I'm sorry if you hear my typing. I was looking it up really quick. If you look at Mike Mann's new book, he summarizes the entire history of climate denialism and climate research really well. And the New Climate War, I think it's called. Okay. Is that his old book? Yeah, The New Climate War by Mike Mann. It covers everything, but what I'm talking about now is included in that as well. It's a really good resource for that current thinking on it. Right. Yeah,
that's great. Because related to that, one of the things I always worried about was that if the effect is so far out, right? If we finally convince everyone to do something, right? And so we pull back all of our emissions, but it keeps warming for another 20 years because the effect is delayed. People are going to, it's not doing any good. So why bother doing it?
Right.
We actually are able to see an effect within a few years that will really make people motivated. Oh, this is actually working. And so we can even do even more. It's worth, what the sacrifices we're having to make or whatever are worth it. Right.
Yeah.
So that's really good news. Sonny, I was going to bring up to religion is that, so tying it to religion was something else that's in this other paper that I was talking about. So my paper is on the Orville. It's the episode If the Stars Should Appear. And I talk about two aspects of denialism. One of them is the lukewarmerism, but the other part is the religion, and it's specifically very prominent. Denialism is very prominent in evangelicalism, which is where my home religion's where I came from. And what's interesting is that it's not rooted theologically, right? Evolution denial is scientifically wrong, but I can at least understand it from a theological viewpoint, right? If you believe the Bible is literally true cover to cover, and so you got to believe in Genesis 1, and so the world is 6,000 years and blah, blah, blah. Well, then to protect that theology, you've got to deny evolution, right? That doesn't make it true, but at least I can understand, how it leads to be there, right?
Right.
Theologically, evangelicals have just as much reason to care about the environment as anybody else, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and in fact, in the early aughts, in the early 2000s, there was the Evangelical Climate Initiative, that was basically arguing like God gave us the earth and right, and that we have this obligation to look after it, and so we need to be concerned about climate change and the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And it got squashed, not because of theology, not because, well, our doctrines entail that this is not the case, but because people saw their political power slipping. The right realized that in the culture wars, environmentalist side is from the left. If you've got evangelicals concerned about the climate, that's going to pull them politically to the left. That means that we lose our power, so we have to deny this. And so they wrapped it up in the culture war. And so now, to be evangelical, you can't be concerned about the environment, otherwise you're on the side of the devil. Yeah. And so because of that, again, it's wrapped up in their self-identity, they deny all of it, right? And sometimes even, even despite the obvious warming, people will still say it's fake news or whatever, right? Yeah. And so, but it's interesting that it's not theological. One of the things that I think in An Inconvenient Truth, right? Al Gore says something like the evangelicals may not be concerned about it because they just think Jesus is going to return. So who cares, right? But that's not what they say. They don't say I'm not worried about climate change because Jesus will come back before it gets bad. They just deny that it's happening or that it's anything to worry about. Like that the effects won't be there, right? Mm-hmm. And again, because it's wrapped up in that culture war,
right?
And the persecution complex, but
right. And when I said that that people say that it's or what I have heard is that people are saying. Christians are saying, well, it doesn't matter anyway because God is in control and this is all part of the plan and all of that. Because that's what I hear from lay people, just people who have no clue. And whenever you're talking to them, like I have a relative and we're talking about it. And after he just realizes he doesn't have anything else to go to, that's his fallback. Yeah, it's like, take care of it. I don't even care. I just don't care because God's in control.
Right. Yeah, well, go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, I don't care if somebody doesn't care. Just leave us alone. You cannot care about. I don't care about a lot of things because, like, I tell you what I don't care about. In my neighborhood, there's a big controversy going on right now about lines painted on roads because the traffic engineers, our community has grown enough. Traffic engineers have come in and they're redesigning all the roads.
Right.
Putting in some circles, putting in some lines, and everybody's apoplectic about it. And I'm thinking, I'm not a traffic engineer. You don't want my opinion. I'll just get used to the circles. And all those people are complaining that they can't go fast enough by the daycare center. I just don't care what they think. And I just wish everyone didn't care about traffic engineering. It would make our city council meetings go much more smoothly.
Oh my gosh, I love city council meetings.
Yeah, we have a similar problem here where we're in the neighborhood I'm in. We're now required to have flood insurance when we didn't have it before, but it's because they redrew the flood maps.
And you can get it. You can get flood insurance. You must not be in California.
Yeah, we're not in California. But it'd be through FEMA, but it'd be required. We would be, we'd be mandated to have it.
That's the same here as well.
But like people are all upset about it. Like that now they're gonna have to pay this. It's like you're not an expert in this, right? Like there have been people out surveying and and they understand. We live right next to a very large river that has flooded numerous times before, and they understand where the flood waters are very likely to go. And so, right, and everybody thinks they're an expert on it, right?
Where are you?
Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they have a good friend, Paul Douglas, who co-wrote one of those evangelical climate change books with a bishop. He's a locally famous meteorologist. Grew up in part of Pennsylvania that I can't remember the name. A major hurricane came into Pennsylvania in about 1965.
1972, I think.
No, it was way earlier than that.
Okay, all right. That's Agnes is the flood of 72. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was earlier than that because he would have been. Okay, it could have been. No, maybe it was 72. Yeah, no, it could have been. It could have been. He was a Boy Scout at the time, and he's my age now. So figure that out. Anyway, it killed lots of people, and one of the things that happened in his neighborhood was it took out a veteran cemetery. And bodies and coffins, hundreds, were floating down the river and depositing parts and things in yards. It was a horrifying experience for everybody.
Does the name 40 Fort sound familiar to you?
That sounds vaguely familiar. Is that it?
That's it.
Okay. Okay.
I used to live right by that cemetery.
Okay. Well, you might have been Paul Douglas's neighbor then. So his crew, Doug Kruhofer is his name, but he was a Boy Scout, and he organized flood warning systems for that river valley. He helped get flood gauges put in places and became a famous meteorologist. He's the guy in Jurassic Park. They're watching a storm coming in, and they've got the radar screen going with a storm coming in. It's going to destroy the fences and let the dinosaurs out. You don't see Paul, but he's on his back underneath the that's his software. That's his actual storm tracking software that he wrote. But there's something wrong with the computer monitor. So he's on his back underneath the table, like holding wires in place while they're filming it.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a digression.
Yeah, so that's the Wyoming Valley. That's the valley that I live in. And in 1972, Hurricane Agnes stalled.
Agnes, yeah, that was it. I'm sure that was it.
And Susquehanna flooded here, and it was the 44th Cemetery, which had veterans from the Civil War.
Okay, well, you should.
Wow.
We'll have to get you and Paul and me together for a beer sometime.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Yeah, I lived on Shoemaker Street right there, and I had neighbors who lived through that in 72. I moved there in 06. There was a flood in 06. There was another one in 11. We had levees up there by then, so there wasn't flooding in 44 then. There was flooding upriver, like in whatever, and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But I had neighbors who lived through that and said, "Oh yeah, there were dead Civil War veterans in this tree." Right. Like it flooded high enough, and they just got stuck in the tree. It was pretty horrific.
Wow, that's just crazy. I do want to say hello to everyone who's in the chat really quickly. There's some great conversations. So Alma, hey Alma, Carrie Ann, Jesus is here. Jesus Tales, John Hudson. And if I'm missing anyone, I'm so sorry. I'm just so glad to see all of you there. There's I was kind of clicking on some of the questions that were going in. I just realized that Jesus has a lot of questions.
Well, I have a lot of questions for Jesus too.
So Jesus Tales, he says, do we have to drastically change our behavior? Energy demand is through the roof.
Yes, we have to drastically change our behavior. For example, instead of going out in the middle of the wintertime in the slush to put liquid explosive in your car, you could just leave your car in the garage and it takes care of itself. That's one thing you have to do. Instead of having to bring your car in to have the oil changed every so many miles and have the transmission rebuilt for great expenses and some other stuff like that, you just don't, because your car won't have those parts. And instead of having to become slightly ill over time because you're breathing in fumes from your gas stove, you'll be using your electric induction stove, and your house will be much safer and less likely to explode. So there's a lot of changes we'll have to make to shift from highly inefficient energy sources where over half the energy we end up using is turned into heat we can't get rid of in order to move things. We're going to have a much more efficient way to do it, and that's just going to make a lot of things a lot. You'll want to buy flood insurance eventually, and the air will be generally cleaner because those who live in, I don't know how bad it's in Pennsylvania, but Minnesota, we're right next to Canada, and it's on fire. Not right now. It's starting right now. You won't have to keep changing the air filter in your filters or own air filters as much because the air will be more breathable. So lots of changes will have to happen as we transit from burning, ancient dinosaur juice, which is not really ancient dinosaur juice, to using sunlight and wind to create our energy. I think those are the kinds of changes we'll have to make. So it'll be drastic.
Do you want to say anything on that, Kyle, before I?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in my Don't Look Up chapter is how, not that I disagree with anything that that Greg said, more renewable, using more renewables and more efficient, energy efficient appliances and all that kind of stuff is all good all the way across the board. But from the authors on climate change that I've read and have insisted that won't be enough, that individual changes, not only just like me doing it won't be enough, but that even everybody doing that won't be enough because our entire energy grid relies on fossil fuels. And so everything that you do, no matter how much you try to cut back and be more efficient or whatever, you're still going to have a pretty major carbon footprint. The entire way our society is structured, which is structured around fossil fuels, is going to have to change. And that means that, fossil fuel companies will have to go out of business and be replaced by, more energy, non-fossil fuel energy companies and methods and that kind of stuff. And so it's got to be a societal change. And the only way that's going to happen is governmental regulation. The free market's not going to take care of this. Right.
Right.
And so, it will not require, if we had the political will, and it would not require us to give up our homes and live in huts and not eat hot food anymore. Like, we could still live roughly the way that we do, right? Just with alternate energy sources, if we are willing to make the kind of short-term sacrifices in order to make that happen. But
Right.
one of the I think one of the things that corporations have done is try to shift the blame for climate change onto individual actors and convince them that, well, it's your fault, so you need to behave differently in order to solve this. We don't need to do anything, right? No, it's got to be all of us, and it's especially got to be the corporations and companies. Otherwise, the problems, not going to get solved.
Yeah,
I
and to underscore that point, Kyle, is absolutely true. That individual change is great, and it does help energize people, raise awareness, blah blah blah. But regulatory change, and we know what there was a study recently done here in Minnesota looking at all of the things that have happened in the last 20 years. And the distinction between regulatory change and personal change is enormous. It's about 10 to 1 factor as to how much carbon, literally counting how many carbon molecules they're putting out. Because we made this regulatory change is enormous, because people did something different is very small.
Right.
So it's absolutely essential that it be that way. And that's okay, because our power, we already use electricity. I mean, for a lot of things. Across from my house is a parking lot it's a city parking lot, and it's got about 15 charger stations that the city put in. So you might look at, as you said, someone said, let's do this, and immediately some libertarian council members, which we all got rid of all of them by now, but in those days we had some, and they were like, no, we have to redesign the grid in order to put those things in there. But what had happened was, in the previous 3 years, all the halogen lamps have been replaced with LED lamps.
Mm-hmm.
So all the wiring in this city is ready to put car chargers everywhere. We could put them up and down the streets.
Yeah.
So we're already using an electric system. We're already creating energy on a grid. All we have to do, and so it's not so hard to do. A really good example people should look at is Germany, because Germany relied on, they switched out nuclear, and they switched in methane. And then suddenly the methane became controlled by Putin, and Germany is an ally of Ukraine. So 2 winters ago, they were looking at a winter, or a few winters in a row, where they were going to have people dying in Germany because there was no electricity or source of energy. So they got their asses in gear. They were doing things like creating 3-dimensional coats you'd put on buildings, like a 3-foot thick thing you'd put on a giant apartment building just to insulate it. And they put up wind turbines, and they started a hydrogen project for their glass industry, which is really huge. And they got themselves out from under methane in like 18 months, not 100%, but enough to survive. And they're continuing to do it. And our state sent a delegation there to find out what they did and bring back that knowledge. But when you really have to do it, it can be done really fast. So yeah, I agree with Kyle.
Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that, I have all kinds of questions about that. Like you were talking about moving to electricity. One of the things that I keep hearing is every time we say we need to move from this to this, I keep hearing, well, that is no better. This, whatever it is just as bad. Do you not understand that that's creating the same pollution? And I'm just curious about that. Everything has its own footprint.
Right.
But we know that fossil fuels have a much larger footprint than electricity or wind or any of the kind of renewable energies. But they still have a footprint, right?
Well, go ahead, Kyle.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, a lot of it is the Ginger Rogers problem. Wind and solar and electric cars and so on are being asked to dance backwards in high heels at the same level that, So, for example, cobalt. Let's cry about cobalt for a long time because there are slaves in the Congo getting cobalt out of the ground. And cobalt replaces fossil fuels. Okay, but let's not mention the fact that in order to refine petroleum, you use cobalt, and the cobalt that's used in that refining system is lost at a regular rate, and the cobalt used in batteries is totally recyclable. Let's not mention the fact that there aren't any slaves in the Congo removing cobalt from the ground. There's like diamonds. There's like bad cobalt and good cobalt, and we're not allowed legally to use the bad cobalt. We're going to have a cobalt shortage. until we design a battery that doesn't use it, or a lithium shortage until we get a battery that doesn't use it. Well, if you buy a Tesla in China, it doesn't use it. The Teslas in China don't use cobalt, folks. So we have batteries like that. They're not as good. So it's everything. All the arguments that are made ignore the other side. They ignore the enormous amount of material and energy you need to make a regular car with all that metal. I mean, electric cars have a big, heavy battery, but non-electric cars have all this specialized metal alloys that are using the transmission and the engine, and it's it has just a different set of problems. Okay, the difference is, where are you removing sequestered carbon and putting it into the atmosphere? So everything's messy. Everything's going to have a cost. Everything's going to have to require more engineering. We just want the version that doesn't put the planet-destroying gas into the atmosphere.
Right.
That's what we want, and we have that, and it has its own problems, But it's a gish gallop on that side. They're doing a gish gallop on that.
No, I'm so glad that you said that's very interesting. The next question that Jesus had was, anybody ready for nuclear? We need lots of energy, probably more than anyone is projecting. So that's kind of two things. First of all, I'm curious about nuclear. I keep hearing that it's such a great thing, but it makes me nervous because when it goes bad, it goes really bad, and people can't live in that area, for decades. So what do you feel about nuclear? And then, do we really need more energy than anyone is projecting?
Greg?
Well, okay.
I'm curious what you thought about this too, Greg.
Okay, and I have a question for you, Kyle, when I'm done. First of all, there is a theoretical nuclear power plant that people talk about. It uses metal to cool, so it can't melt down because it's already melted down in a sense. It uses old waste energy, old waste nuclear material. It burns that instead of other stuff. It doesn't produce any significant amount of waste nuclear energy, and it can't be used by terrorists to create bombs. Okay. Now, every one of those features is a feature you can find in a design, but the collection of them cannot be found in any given design. It's almost like I'm going back to 1900 and saying, hey, I got an idea. I have a thing in mind. It goes underwater and it flies through the air. It holds lots of people. It goes really fast, and it will fit in your garage. And I've just explained, an airplane and a submarine and a motorcycle and a bus, and I'm telling you, it's all one single vehicle, and that's bullshit. Okay, so the nuclear generator that people talk about as what we must have simply doesn't exist. Okay, there are some really interesting technologies. I'm very concerned about nuclear, but I'm also a scientist, and I can tell you right now that all of those nuclear power plants in the United States that have the same basic design as we saw in Fukushima, they didn't blow up. They're fine. They're safe. They're being operated properly. Fukushima had a site location problem. Okay. Right. Yes. And it's not that bad. I think we should keep them going, but I'm not for future nuclear because, number one, it's a made up thing. It doesn't exist. Yes, there are nuclear plants we can build in the future, but they're not what people are talking about. So if you want to talk about nuclear, please talk about actual nuclear technology that can actually be deployed in the future. And then what are the costs and benefits of that? And when you do that, you're going to find out that it is way more expensive than you think.
Wow. It's
the most expensive form of energy you can get. So I'm not entirely opposed to it, but I do think you have to. We have a nuclear plant not far from me in a Native American community that is sitting right in the reservation, because that's where they were able to push it there, and it has a waste. It's on the river, and if it did what Fukushima did, the exclusion zone would include the entire reservation and like 10 times more area than that. So I'm really concerned about where you would put these things in the event that bad thing does happen. But I'm not necessarily completely against it, but it doesn't solve the problem is the thing. So let's build a nuclear. We have a big coal plant closing right now. Well, let's close it. Let's build an equivalent nuclear power plant. There's already one there. There's two reactors in a coal plant next to each other. Let's add 2 more reactors in, starting now. Let's use a future technology. Okay, you can't because it doesn't exist. So let's use whatever combination exists. Begin now. Okay, we'll have that plant operating in 25 years. You can't build a nuclear power plant faster than that. And so in the meantime, right now, the alternative is we are actually building a field of wind turbines there that's going to produce the same amount that the coal plant did. We can have them completed in 5 years. So which do you want to do? And for maybe a 20th of the cost, which do you want? You choose. Do you want the inexpensive wind that we can do right now, or the long-term nuclear that we can't do? So I'm not completely against it. It's just that when you add it all up, it doesn't work. But I want to know from Kyle, didn't you write something about fusion?
I did.
What about fusion? It's always 40 years in advance. Is it now 39 years?
Yeah, right. So what I wrote about fusion was that the breakthrough that happened whenever that was last year, or whatever that was, I was afraid gave people a false sense of hope and might actually make things worse.
Right.
Because people would think, oh, well, fusion's right around the corner. I don't need to reduce my carbon footprint. Within 5 years, there's going to be a fusion plant next to my house, or I'm going to have a fusion reactor inside my house, and so I don't need to do anything now because fusion's going to save the day. Right? That was my concern, and that is extremely unlikely for two reasons. I mean, that's just bad for two reasons. One, if fusion's going to be reality, it's not going to be until at least 2050 at best, and we need to have major reductions before 2050. So if we wait for fusion, it's just going to be too late, right? And B, it probably isn't possible. That breakthrough was so much hype, because it was well, technically the amount of energy from the lasers that hit what reacted was slightly less than the energy that thing generated, right? It's we hit it with 2.5 and it produced 3.1, but they leave out the fact that it took 300 to fire the lasers to begin with, right? Not to mention all the other things that went into it, right? And so there was, it was only if you crunch the numbers in the right kind of way, is this actually, did it produce more than it took? And so I maybe in 100 years or something like that, maybe, right? But it's that's what I was concerned about. Is that it was kind of a pipe dream that was going to make people. And it felt I was putting solar panels on my house, and I had a moment where I was like, "Am I going to be able to pay these solar panels up before we have a fusion reactor?"
Yeah, right.
And then I came
yes,
to
you
my
will.
right. Yeah, then I totally came to my senses, and I have a very nice array of solar panels on my house, and we produced more than we used last year. So, with nuclear in general, I am a fan of nuclear. I think that we should basically do everything that we can, wind, solar, nuclear, everything that we can, and do it as fast as we can. I'm not as educated about this as you. My understanding was a lot of the time delay on building a nuclear plant, a lot of it is regulatory and that kind of stuff, and you have to do things in a certain order. And there might be a way to streamline the process so it doesn't take 25 years to build one, right? But that said, right, you have to factor in the carbon footprint of building one, right? Because you have to use it, right? And how long will it take a nuclear power plant to kind of undo its footprint? Same thing with electric cars, right? If you are buying a brand new electric car, there's a carbon footprint for building it, right? And if you are getting your electricity to charge that car from a coal-fired plant, it's going to take a lot longer for that electric car to offset its carbon footprint. It will eventually, but it'll take longer. It wouldn't take nearly as long if it was getting it from nuclear, right? But the same is true for solar and wind as well. So
real quick, I want to show we got a super chat from Jesus. Thank you. We got a super chat for $5. Sane Hassenfelder, YouTube science communicator, thinks global warming is happening faster than expected. What say y'all?
Is that the same person you were mentioning a while ago, Greg?
Yeah. No. This is a woman who does. That's not exactly her name, I think. She's a physicist who's run some really interesting counter physics compared to other physics that are going on. Her theory is that our belief in the beauty of math has led us down the garden path when understanding quantum physics, and left us to. An interesting fact is that the Large Hadron Collider didn't really discover anything new. They're doing this, and nothing else is coming out of it. I mean, they did get the Higgs boson, but that's it.
Okay.
And they knew it was going to happen. They knew it was going to look like it, and there it is. And getting bigger and bigger and bigger energies into the system should have produced more results than it has. And the reason it was supposed to produce more results is because of the beauty of the mathematics. And she's saying it really wasn't that beautiful. But the point about global warming, I actually mentioned this before, is that this theory that global warming whether it's happening faster or slower is one thing. What's being specifically said is that the rate is higher than our models expected it to be. So there's extra global warming happening. That's the important. That's what's being said. That's what she's saying. She's not saying it. She's not basing this on any of her own research. She's repeating this concern that other people have stated. And what all of the experts I know who are like the leading experts on this, and I've heard this argument and I've read the papers, I'm convinced of it. It just isn't true. It just is not true that the rate of global warming is unexpectedly high. It's still serious and it's still bad, and we still have to deal with it. But there's not an extra bit. There's not an extra wedge on the graph that we can't explain of highness of.
Like the models aren't worse or whatever, right?
Right.
Or it's not worse than the models predicted. Excuse me.
Right. It's not worse than the models are currently tracking.
Well, thank you again, Jesus Tales, for the $5 super chat. I hated to interrupt you, Kyle, but I wanted to get that in. It's awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so back to our conversation.
In relation to nuclear, and I want to ask Greg about this too. My understanding was that episode in Germany where they shut down the nuclear power plants, and then there was a problem with pressure. They realized that they didn't have enough energy. They thought they were going to be able to supplement it with wind, and they didn't have enough, and so they ended up firing up a bunch of coal plants to make up the difference.
I would be careful about what you've heard, because I've heard all kinds of things that are like not accurate. But something like that probably did happen. In fact, I think they were considering, what I heard was they were trying to decide what to do. And refiring coal plants and actually firing up a nuclear plant, because they're not gone. Right. They're all on the table. Yeah. They're all on the table. They had to do some of that to get, but that wasn't because they had a plan over 20 years or so, replacing everything wind and solar with methane as an in-between fuel. And then someone pulled the methane out of there. Putin pulled out the methane and said, no, not for you yet. And so they had to do something. So that wasn't a failure of wind. It was a failure of politics. And also maybe they should have not used methane as much as a bridge fuel. They maybe shouldn't have used it as much as a bridge fuel as they did. Just like we are using it now as a bridge fuel. We've replaced coal with methane, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it just occurred. It seemed strange. It seemed short-sighted to me for them to it takes money and effort to shut down a nuclear power plant, and they were working and they shut them down. Right. It's like, if you need an interim, use that in the interim and build your solar and wind. And then when you have enough of that, then shut down the nuclear.
Right. And that's what we did not do in this country.
Right.
And that's a good thing that we didn't do it. They probably shouldn't have done it. But the other thing is, when you say before, the reason it takes so long to build a plant, one of the reasons is because of the regulatory process, and that also includes a political process. Mm-hmm. That's true. But again, it's a Ginger Rogers effect. You can build anything, and there's a process where people are going to oppose it. So it's probably worse with nuclear, and I agree with that. But it's always part of the process. That the time it takes to build something, like right now. I mentioned the parking lot across the street. They're going to turn it into an ice hockey center. They're already there. They're going to expand the hockey center. Okay. Well, there's a law against raising local sales tax in Minnesota that sunsets in 2 years. Then you can't even talk about it until then. Once it sunsets, then they will introduce a bill saying allow Plymouth, Minnesota to charge a tax. And then they will go to the city council and they will be allowed to. So it's going to take 6 years before they break ground on the new ice hockey thing. It's going to take them 1 year to build it. So 5 out of 6 years are going to be sitting around because of these legal things. That's just true of every single thing. Mm-hmm. And nuclear maybe is a little bit more severe than that, but yeah.
But again, if we could, I don't know, cut the red tape or whatever. I don't know what that really entails, whatever. Maybe we could make it quicker. One of the analogies that I heard is like with the COVID vaccine, that usually it takes a very long time to do these kind of things, because you have to do things in a certain order. Like you have to have it initially, and then you have to do the testing, and then you do the whatever. And instead, they did them all at once, right? They did the testing and the production and stuff, and so they were able to shorten that. And so maybe a similar kind of approach could.
And that's a really good analogy, because the other thing with COVID is the way that the vaccine worked also allowed it to be tested faster. Something about the technology of the vaccine, and these if there's a nuclear power technology that you can go from, we don't all have any to we can have some, and they're these medium-sized or small plants. I say build them. I say build them in Ohio, because that's where the center of the nuclear movement exists right now. Build them in Ohio. If you can get the people of Ohio to accept it, build it there. Build a couple of them, a couple different designs. They don't have to be huge. Right. I don't care how much. I actually don't care how much they cost, because a brand new technology is going to cost a lot. So what?
Right.
The first Tesla cost, $10 million, right? The first pharmaceutical pill costs $15 million. It's because you make many of them, they get caught. So build two, get two engineering groups, two competing designs, try out different, because again, you can't have all those things in one feature and all those features in one design. Build two and try it out and see how it goes. Make sure you build it, in a smart place with respect to both safety and access to the grid, and see how it goes, and do it fast. And if that over 5 years, and then in 5 years, we can have this conversation again and see, well, gee, that ended up costing $3 billion and it broke. Not good. Or, it costs way less than we thought, and it's producing reliable energy. Let's make some more.
Right.
So I'm not really anti-nuclear, and just very, very suspicious of. I worked for the nuclear industry briefly. When I was doing archaeology, I did the archaeology for a nuclear power plant, and I learned something. The word power in the power company, the name power company, or the power authority. I was working in New York. It's called the power authority. The word power has nothing to do with electricity, nothing at all. and if we look at Ohio, where there are people who are starting to serve their prison sentence time now over nuclear. When I look at the fact of a few years ago, our environmental agency, our party's environmental caucus, one day a bunch of people showed up and they wanted to be on the board of our caucus. One person offered us a $10,000 bribe to be on our board. They were all from a pro-nuclear lobby that wanted to help get the moratorium on nuclear in Minnesota, which we used to have, we still have it, lifted. So my interaction with the nuclear power industry is they're a bunch of thugs. Okay, so it's expensive. There's lies out there about it, and they're a bunch of thugs. So I personally believe that somewhere behind there is a possibility of doing something. Okay, and there are some restaurants where I grew up in upstate New York. There are some restaurants that are really good restaurants, and they employ people and have good food, and nobody gets food poisoning. But they were created by the mafia. Okay, so I think you can get this can work. But I'm just a little bit skeptical about some of it. That's all.
Well, for those of you in the live chat and those of you who watch this later on, in the comment section, please put down what you are doing right now to try to help the climate crisis. It could be anything from using those cardboard straws instead of the plastic straws or anything else. Just put down in the chat what you are doing to help with the climate crisis. Now, we are at the end of the show, and we didn't even get to the papers that you guys had. And so,
I did. I mentioned some for mine.
Yeah, you did. I'm wondering if you guys maybe want to do a part 2 at some point.
Sure.
I enjoyed this very much. I learned a lot from Greg too. So,
yeah, fantastic. Because I would really I would love to go into some of those a little bit more and really kind of hit some of those things. So we'll set that up and have a part 2.
Don't Look Up with you. I really want to talk about Don't Look Up.
Yeah, absolutely. I do too. I'm really excited about that. But we had such a great discussion. I didn't want to end that. It was fabulous. So I really do appreciate you guys coming on and having the discussion. Before you leave, what is something that you would like for people to take away from our discussion today, and maybe something you would like to talk about in our next our part 2? So, Greg, we'll start with you.
I think that, frankly, because of in the last few years has involved so much. We've had a lot of success in the political arena with getting regulatory change related to climate change in Minnesota. We were bottled up. We couldn't do anything, and all of a sudden we did more in the last 2 or 3 cycles than any other state has ever done. In one set, we're beyond California now, practically, except in vehicles. And I think that has involved education and involvement and activism. And right now, at this exact moment, as of right now, people are getting very excited about politics. Let's keep climate change in that political arena. Let's get excited about addressing environmental issues and climate change specifically, and energy, and not get distracted by. We have to deal with other issues too. Climate change is a long-term issue. Other things are short-term issues. Climate change is always on the top of people's lists, as is education, right up there on top. But it's always moved down 3 or 4 slots because something else is more urgent, always. So I'd like to see us not have lists anymore. Just address it and deal with it. And that means getting involved in your local political situation with your city, with your county, with your state legislators, and they're accessible to you because they're there and they want to talk to you and you want to talk to them. I think people should get more involved in that area.
Excellent. Excellent. And you, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, for next time, watch Don't Look Up. And then for...
Yes, good idea.
Yeah.
You got a watch party. That's a great idea.
Fantastic.
Fun. I mean, I think I have a very similar thing to say to Greg. This is part of the point of my paper on Don't Look Up, is that really, I mean, he's thought, Greg saying not have a list or whatever, but for me, climate change is the number one issue. It should dwarf every other issue that you'd ever be possibly voting on. And so with the upcoming election or whatever, you need to consider how important it is, how vitally important it is to have someone, regardless of what you think about any of the other politics or whatever, someone who actually admits that climate change is real and is dedicated to doing something about it. We don't have 4 years to waste. We don't have 4 more years to waste, right? We already wasted the latter half of the last decade, 2016 to 20, rolling things back, right? In 22, we had the largest climate initiative, passed anywhere, which was a huge boon, but it was not enough. We need to do more, and we don't have time to mess around with BS for another 4 years. So, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much. If you guys like what we were talking about today, if you guys like some of the other conversations that we've had on the channel, please subscribe. It really helps us a lot, but also just liking and sharing, communicating in the live chat is awesome. And comments, even if you're watching it later, just comment. It really does help us a lot. But if you want to do more, you might want to consider becoming a patron. And so I want to thank our current patrons: Paul Kamish, Karen Butcher, Puck, Helen Green, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Eric Ozols, Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dandy, Michael Wiseman, myself, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. You don't have to give much, but every bit helps. So please think about doing that. Also, we are always looking for volunteers for producing, booking, and call screening for our call-in show. So if you're interested, contact us at westeastardevent@gmail.com. You can help us become a better community. Also, we have other shows, and we actually have some new shows. So on Mondays, we now have Black Free Thinkers. It is amazing. Tuesdays, Secular Soapbox. Of course, Thursdays are with me. Saturdays at the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload. And then on Sundays, we have Let's Talk, which is the call-in show. You can call in. We have all kinds of great conversations. I do want to plug the show this Saturday on Women Atheist Unload. I will be on there with a panel, and we're talking about Project 2025. So please check that out. I'm really excited about that show. So I think, one more thing that I want to tell you guys about. We are going to be trying out the Discord, and so we're starting to get that thing running. So hopefully in the future, maybe I'll have some of my guests and myself going into Discord for kind of an after show. So if you would like something like that, please comment in the chat and let me know that you would like to do that and actually be able to talk to the guests that we have coming on for 30 minutes or so. So that's everything. I think that's all of my announcements. So come back. I really want you to be able to interact with these wonderful hosts that I bring, or guests that I bring in. But in the meantime, always remember to think critically. Good night, everybody.
Part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.